Take her back. I ordered a woman, not a broken mule. Silas Montgomery did not lower his voice. He wanted the whole platform to hear. And they did. Every last soul standing in the dust of Bitter Creek Station on that gray October morning in 1874 turned to look. And most of them laughed. Alice Abernathy stood motionless beside her single trunk, her travel-worn coat buttoned to the throat against the cold, her hands folded in front of her the way a person holds themselves together when they are terrified of falling apart in public. She had come 2,000 miles on the strength of 23 letters. 23 letters full of promises, a home, a future, a man who wrote that he valued a woman's character above all else. She had believed every word. Now that man was looking at her the way a buyer looks at a lame horse at auction. "Look at her," Silas said to the deputy beside him, loud enough to carry. "She didn't mention the limp, or the scar. Lord Almighty, she didn't mention any of it." He flicked his hand as though dismissing a servant. "The arrangement is void. I want nothing to do with her." The crowd murmured. A woman near the general store pressed her lips together and looked away. Two men by the water trough elbowed each other and snickered. Alice felt the heat of their stares like a brand against her skin. She had 42 cents in her coat pocket, no return ticket, and nowhere in this town she could call shelter. She was thinking about what it means to have nothing, truly nothing, when the laughter stopped. Not gradually, all at once. A shadow fell across the platform, long and wide, cast by a man who had no business being that large. He moved through the crowd the way a river moves through rock, not around, but through, and people stepped aside without quite knowing why. He was somewhere past 40, with a beard the color of iron and eyes that had seen too much of both wilderness and grief to be bothered by the opinions of a crowd. He stopped 3 feet from Silas Montgomery and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Alice. Not at her scar, not at her limp. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he is genuinely trying to understand. "You the woman from the Eastern letters?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged in open country. Alice straightened her spine. "I am." He gave a single nod. "Then I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing."
Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Right now, wherever you are in this world, what city are you listening from? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one.
His name was Josiah Culleton. Most people in Bitter Creek called him Huck, the way people give nicknames to things they cannot quite categorize. A mountain, a river, a man who does not fit the ordinary molds of ordinary life. He had come down from Whispering Ridge that morning for flour and nails, and he was supposed to be back before noon. He had not planned on any of this, but then neither had Alice. She sat across from him at the far end of the station bench, her trunk between them like a small wooden wall, while he explained himself in the fewest words a man could use and still be understood. He had twin children, 6 years old, a boy and a girl. Their mother had died the previous winter. He was not looking for a wife in the way other men were, not for sentiment, not for companionship, not for anything that required her to feel something she did not feel. He needed someone capable, someone who would treat his children with decency, someone who, in plain terms, was in need of a place as much as he was in need of help. Alice listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I want it in front of a judge," she said. "A legal marriage, properly recorded. I want my own sleeping quarters." I want to be spoken to with respect, and I want the right to leave if I find the arrangement is not what you've described." Huck looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The way a man recognizes solid ground after a long time walking on ice. "Agreed," he said. What Alice did not say, because there was no language for it yet, was how much it cost her to sit upright on that bench and speak those words. She had grown up the daughter of a Philadelphia seamstress, slight and quick-fingered, until a carriage accident at 17 left her with a permanent limp and a scar along her jaw that men like Silas Montgomery saw before they saw anything else. She had spent the years since becoming invisible, learning to enter rooms quietly, to take up as little space as possible, to make herself useful enough that people might tolerate her presence even if they could not quite look at her directly. The 23 letters had felt like a miracle. A man who asked about her interests, her education, her opinions on literature and weather and the Western Territories. She had written back carefully, honestly, holding nothing back except the things she assumed he already understood, that she was not beautiful, that she walked with a cane on bad days, that she carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has been made to feel like a burden for long enough that she has half believed it herself. She understood now that Silas Montgomery had not read her letters so much as he had collected them, the way a man collects tools he intends to use and then discards when they disappoint him. She would not be discarded again, not if she could help it. The judge at Bitter Creek was a man named Harlow, round and red-faced, and thoroughly inconvenienced by being asked to perform a marriage on a Tuesday morning with no advance notice. He did it anyway, witnessed by the station clerk and a one-eyed cattle driver who happened to be passing through and seemed genuinely moved by the occasion. Alice signed her name in the registry with a steady hand. Huck signed beside her, his signature large and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to read and write late and was not ashamed of it. Afterward, he carried her trunk to the wagon without being asked. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary thing, and yet Alice stood for a moment watching him lift it as though it weighed nothing, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The faint, fragile sensation of being considered. The wagon rolled out of Bitter Creek beneath a sky the color of pewter, headed north toward the mountains. Alice sat straight on the wooden seat, her cane tucked beside her, watching the town disappear behind a curtain of dust. She did not look back at the station platform. She did not look back at the place where she had been told she was not enough. She looked forward toward the ridgeline, pale and enormous against the clouds. There is a particular kind of cruelty in a crowd's laughter. Not the cruelty of one person, but the cruelty of many people choosing comfort over conscience, choosing the safety of agreement over the discomfort of standing apart. And there is a particular kind of courage in the person who refuses to perform shame on cue, who lifts their chin not because they feel no pain, but because they have decided that their dignity does not belong to the people trying to take it. We have all stood at the edge of someone else's humiliation. We have all felt that pull, the easy path of looking away, of telling ourselves it is not our concern, of waiting for someone else to act first. But somewhere in each of us lives the question that moment always asks, if not now, if not here, if not you, then who? The road north out of Bitter Creek was not a road so much as a suggestion. Two wheel ruts pressed into the earth by years of wagon traffic, wandering upward through scrub pine and loose shale toward country that grew wilder with every mile. The sky had been the color of old pewter when they left town, By the time the last rooftop disappeared behind a curve in the trail, it had darkened to the shade of a bruise. Huck drove the wagon with the ease of a man who has made the same journey so many times that his hands know the way without consulting his mind. He did not speak. He did not fill the silence with pleasantries or explanations. He simply drove, and the horses, two broad-chested roans named in a language he did not offer to translate, moved steadily forward, as though they too understood that the mountain did not wait for conversation. Alice sat beside him and watched the land change. She had grown up with the compressed geography of a city, where distance was measured in blocks and the sky appeared only in strips between rooftops. This was something else entirely. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a cathedral built by something that had no interest in human scale. The pines thickened and darkened. The air thinned and sharpened, carrying the smell of cold water and pine resin and something she could not name, the smell of altitude itself, perhaps, or simply the smell of a world that had existed long before anyone thought to put a name to it. The temperature dropped steadily as they climbed. Alice had dressed for a train platform, not a mountain pass. She pressed her arms against her sides and said nothing, watching her breath appear in small clouds before her face and dissolve. After perhaps an hour, Huck reached behind the wagon seat without looking and produced a wool blanket folded into a square. He held it out to her, his eyes still on the trail. She took it. She did not thank him immediately. The gesture had been too matter-of-fact for the ordinary courtesies. And she wrapped it around her shoulders and felt the warmth begin to work its way through the layers of her coat. It smelled of wood smoke and something faintly medicinal, pine tar, perhaps, the smell of a life lived close to the elements. "How far?" she asked. 4 hours in good weather." He glanced at the sky. "We'll push through." She nodded and asked nothing further. She was not, by nature, a woman who required conversation to feel at ease. She had spent too many years in rooms where her presence was merely tolerated to have developed any appetite for small talk. Silence, she had long ago decided, was simply the absence of pretending. The trail steepened. The wagons swayed and groaned around bends that seemed engineered specifically to test the nerve of anyone sitting on the outside edge. Below them, through breaks in the trees, valleys opened up, enormous, silent, dusted with the first thin snow of the season, lying in the low places like scattered flour. Alice found herself holding the edge of the seat and watching the drop with something that was equal parts fear and wonder. At one particularly sharp switchback, the wagon lurched, and she slid several inches toward the open edge. Her hand shot out instinctively and caught the iron bar along the seat's side, but not before Huck's arm had come across in the same instant, a reflex, solid and immediate, pressing briefly against her forearm before he withdrew it and returned both hands to the reins. Neither of them spoke about it, but Alice felt the warmth of that contact long after the cold had erased every other sensation. It had lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It meant nothing, she told herself. A man's instinct to stop something from falling. Nothing more. She looked at the valley below and said nothing. They stopped once, in a narrow, flat place where a creek crossed the trail through a shallow ford. Huck unhitched the horses and let them drink while he built a small fire from wood he carried in the wagon bed, already split, already dried, as though he had anticipated every need of a journey he had made alone for the past year. He hung a small tin pot over the flames and produced from a canvas bag 2 portions of cornbread wrapped in cloth, handing one to Alice without ceremony. She sat on a rock beside the fire and ate. The cornbread was dense and slightly sweet and tasted to her like something close to salvation. The fire made a small, warm circle in the vast cold, and within that circle, for the first time since the train had pulled into Bitter Creek Station, Alice felt the particular stillness of a moment that is not threatening her. Huck sat across the fire from her, eating in his methodical way, and at one point looked up and caught her eye. He did not smile, but something in his expression, some slight easing around the jaw, some fractional softening of the lines at the corners of his eyes, communicated something that Alice, who had spent her life reading the rooms of people who did not quite want her there, recognized immediately. He was not sorry she was here.
The tea he poured from the tin pot was black and bitter and far too hot, and she drank it with both hands wrapped around the cup and thought that she could not remember the last time someone had made her something warm without being asked. When they resumed the trail, the light had begun to flatten toward late afternoon gray, and the trees had grown so dense that the sky appeared only in narrow fragments overhead. The cold deepened. The horse's breath steamed. Alice pulled the blanket tighter and watched the shadows lengthen across the path. And somewhere in the rhythm of the wheels and the creak of the harness and the soft percussion of hooves on frozen earth, she felt the tight coil of fear she had been carrying since Bitter Creek begin, just slightly, just at the edges, to loosen. Then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. A ridge line running east to west across the darkening sky, its crest draped in the season's first true snow. Below it, in a fold of the hillside, a warm point of light, small and steady as a held breath. "Is that?" she began. "Whisper and Ridge," Huck said. "Home." The word landed in the cold air between them, simply, without decoration. He had not said it for her benefit. He had said it the way a man says a word he has needed to say aloud for a long time, to remind himself that it still exists. Alice looked at the light in the fold of the mountain and felt something she had not expected to feel on this particular day, on this particular road, beside this particular silent stranger. She felt the first thin thread of hope. The cabin at Whispering Ridge was not what Alice had imagined, though she had been careful not to imagine too much. It was low and long, built from pine logs chinked with river clay, with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side, and a stone chimney that rose from the center of the roof like a declaration. Firelight pressed against the two front windows from inside, warm and amber, and for a moment, just a moment, the whole structure looked less like a building and more like something alive, something breathing slowly in the cold. Then the door opened and two small figures appeared in the rectangle of light, and the moment passed. The twins were named Samuel and Nora. Samuel was the taller of the two by half an inch, with his father's coloring and his mother's apparent distrust of strangers. He stood with his arms crossed and his chin lifted, and looked at Alice the way a small person looks at a large problem they have decided in advance they cannot solve. Nora stood slightly behind him, one hand gripping the back of his shirt, her eyes wide and dark and taking in everything without committing to any particular expression. "These are my children," Huck said. "Sam, Nora, this is Alice. She'll be staying with us." Samuel said nothing. Nora said nothing. Alice crouched down to their level, which cost her something in her bad knee, and looked at them directly. "I'm not here to replace anyone," she said quietly. "I know that. I'm just here to help, if you'll let me." Samuel uncrossed his arms. He did not smile, but he uncrossed his arms, and Alice counted that as the beginning of something. The interior of the cabin was the accumulated evidence of a year lived by a man alone with two young children, a year of doing the necessary things and none of the optional ones. Dishes stacked in no particular order, a heap of mending by the fireplace that had clearly been heaped there long enough to become furniture.
Mud tracked across the plank floor in patterns that suggested no one had swept since September. Boots in a pile by the door. A broken chair leaning against the wall as though it had simply given up. But the fireplace was magnificent. It had been built by someone who understood fire. Wide and deep, with a proper iron crane for the cooking pot and a stone hearth worn smooth by years of use. The fire in it was large and even and well laid, and the warmth it threw reached every corner of the single main room. Whatever else had been neglected, the fire had not. Alice set her trunk against the wall and looked around without comment. Then she found an apron hanging on a peg near the door, put it on, and began. She did not ask permission. She did not make a speech about what she intended. She simply started with the dishes, working quietly and methodically, and when the dishes were done, she swept the floor, and when the floor was swept, she found the mending pile and sorted it by urgency. The twins watched her from their position near the fireplace with the focused attention of two people watching someone do something they had never seen done in quite that way before. Huck watched her too, from his seat at the table where he was cleaning his rifle, though he watched the way a man watches who does not want to be caught watching, in brief glances, sideways, when he thought her back was turned. It was Nora who broke first. She appeared at Alice's elbow while Alice was sorting the mending, holding out a small sock with a hole in the heel the size of a silver dollar. She said nothing. She simply held it out. Alice took it. She found a needle and thread in her own trunk. She had packed them out of habit, the reflex of a woman who had learned long ago to bring her usefulness with her, and she mended the sock there at the table, slowly enough that Nora could watch every stitch. When she handed it back, Nora examined it with the gravity of a professional, then looked up at Alice. "Mama used to do that," Nora said. It was the first thing either child had said to her. "I know," Alice said gently. "I'm sorry about you, Mama." Nora nodded once, solemnly, and went back to sit by the fire. But she sat facing Alice now, rather than away. The days that followed had their own rhythm, the way life in small spaces always develops its own rhythm, whether the people in it choose one or not. Alice rose before the children and had the fire built up and the porridge started before Huck came in from the barn, stamping the cold from his boots on the porch. She made biscuits on Wednesdays because she had found a tin of good flour, and cornbread the rest of the week, and once, on a Sunday when Huck came back from checking his trap lines with a pair of rabbits, she made a stew that filled the cabin with a smell so deeply comforting that Samuel ate 2 bowls and then fell asleep at the table with his cheek pressed against his folded arms. Huck carried him to his bed without waking him, moving through the small cabin with a gentleness that seemed improbable in so large a body. And when he came back, he found Alice still at the table, her hands wrapped around her cup, watching the door through which he had just passed. He sat down across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke, and the fire settled and popped, and the wind found the gaps between the logs and made its low complaint. And it was the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of two people becoming aware, slowly and with some private resistance, that they have begun to feel comfortable in the same space. "You're good with them," he said finally. "They're easy to be good with," she said. "They just needed someone to show up." He looked at her for a moment. "Most people don't." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, brief and unplanned, the way these things always are. And then she looked down at her cup and he looked at the fire, and neither of them said anything more about it. But that night, lying in the small room he had partitioned for her with a hanging blanket and a curtain of oilcloth, Alice stared at the log ceiling and thought about the way he had said most people don't, and the particular weight of those 3 words coming from a man who had clearly been one of the people who had been left.
It was 3 weeks before he touched her hand. It happened at the table, over the business of teaching her to read the land. He had spread a rough map across the surface, marking water sources and elk trails and the particular ridgeline where the wind came from in a storm, things she needed to know for the children's safety if he was ever away.
He was pointing to a spot on the map, and she leaned in to see, and their hands arrived at the same place at the same moment, hers reaching, his already there. And for the length of several heartbeats, neither of them moved. His hand was rough from cold and work, the knuckles thickened, the skin crossed with small scars that told the story of a life conducted largely outdoors. She could feel the warmth of it against the back of her fingers, like a coal left too close. He did not pull away. She did not pull away. Then Samuel called from the other room and the moment dissolved, and they both straightened, and Huck rolled the map without looking at her, and Alice found something to do with the dishes that did not need doing. But her hand remembered. For the rest of the evening, it remembered. It was Nora who named what was happening before either of the adults did, the way children always name the thing everyone else is pretending not to see. She was sitting between them one evening while Alice read aloud from the one novel in the cabin, a battered copy of something by Dickens that had apparently belonged to Huck's wife. And at some point she looked up from her position leaning against Alice's arm and said, with the complete matter-of-factness of a 6-year-old, "Papa looks at you the way he used to look at the mountains. Like they're the best thing, and he doesn't know how to say it." Alice stopped reading. Huck, across the room, said nothing, but in the firelight, even from across the room, Alice could see the color that moved up the back of his neck, and she felt something bloom in her chest, warm and tentative and frightening, the way anything feels when you have been cold for long enough that warmth itself becomes something to be careful about. She resumed reading, but she did not turn the page for a very long time. The night had snowed in earnest, the first real snow of winter, not the dusting that decorated the ridgeline, but the kind that meant business, falling thick and straight in the windless dark. Huck came in late from checking the animal shelter and found Alice asleep in the chair by the fire, the Dickens novel open in her lap, her head tilted back at an angle that would leave her neck aching in the morning. He stood in the doorway for a moment, still in his coat, the cold coming off him in waves, and looked at her. Then he took the quilt from the chest by the wall, the good one, the one his wife had made, and he laid it over her with the careful hands of a man performing an act of great private significance, tucking it around her shoulders without waking her. She was not asleep. She had woken at the sound of the door and lain very still, her eyes closed, her breathing deliberately even, because she did not know what she would say if she opened her eyes, and she was not ready yet to find out. She felt the weight of the quilt settle over her. She felt the brief warmth of his hands near her shoulder, and she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not afraid. When she heard him move away toward his room, she opened her eyes. The fire had burned low. The snow pressed at the windows, white and dense and absolute. And Alice sat in the chair under the quilt his wife had made and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent a long time knowing exactly what she does not have, that something had shifted. Not love, not yet. She was too careful a woman to call it that so soon. But something real and unhurried, and hers, growing in the warmth of a cabin on a mountain in the first winter of a life she had not planned and could not yet fully imagine, but had begun, slowly, carefully, with the particular courage of the twice wounded, to want. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into the deep snow, that it happened. Not by plan, not by declaration, but by the simple arithmetic of two people occupying the same small space for long enough. Alice was reaching for the flour tin on the high shelf above the fireplace, her bad leg braced, her arm extended, her fingertips just short of it, when Huck came in from the back room and saw what she was doing and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He reached above her for the tin, his arm passing close along her shoulder, his body momentarily near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air. He brought the tin down and held it out to her. She turned to take it.
They were closer than either of them had calculated. She could see the particular gray of his eyes from here, and the lines at their corners, and the way his expression had changed in the weeks since she had come. Something opened in it, something that had been closed for a long time. His gaze dropped for just a moment to the scar along her jaw, and she braced herself for the familiar withdrawal, the flicker of something uncomfortable, the polite looking away. It did not come. He looked at it the way you look at something that is simply part of a person. Then he looked back at her eyes, and then, with the slowness of a man who is very sure and also very afraid, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her cheek. Not her mouth, her cheek, the scarred side, the side she had spent years turning away from the light. His beard was rough, and his lips were warm, and the kiss lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then he straightened and stepped back and looked at her with an expression that contained, in equal measure, the hope that he had not misread everything, and the willingness to accept it quietly if he had. Alice stood very still, the flour tin in her hands, her heart making itself known against her ribs. "Huck?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Don't apologize for that." Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, or perhaps the private collapse of something he had been holding upright for a very long time. He nodded once. And then they stood in the kitchen in the early light, in the smell of wood smoke and coming bread, and the snow fell outside and the fire held, and it was enough. For that morning, it was entirely enough. The men arrived on a Thursday, when the snow had packed hard enough to carry the weight of horses. There were 3 of them. They came up the trail from Bitter Creek in the early afternoon, when the light was flat and gray, and the mountains were the color of old iron, and they announced themselves not by knocking, but by stopping their horses in front of the cabin and waiting, the particular waiting of men who are accustomed to having doors opened for them by people who have reason to be afraid. Alice saw them first from the kitchen window. She had been standing at the basin, washing the breakfast things, watching the ridge the way she had learned to watch it over the weeks of living here, not anxiously, but with the quiet attention of someone who has come to understand that the mountain tells you things if you are willing to listen. The 3 riders appeared at the tree line and moved toward the cabin in a line, and something about the way they held themselves, upright and deliberate, with the particular posture of men who carry authority like a weapon they are not yet pointing but have not put away, made the back of her neck go cold. She dried her hands and went to find Huck. He was in the barn, working the edge of a saw blade that had gone dull. She said only, "3 men coming up the trail," and he set the blade down and went to the door and looked, and whatever he saw in their manner confirmed what Alice had seen in it, because he did not go back for his coat. He simply walked out to meet them. The man who spoke was not the largest of the 3, but he was clearly the one in charge. He had the groomed certainty of someone who has been deferred to for long enough that he has mistaken it for a natural condition of the world. His name, he said, was Caldwell. He represented interests, he said, legal interests. He produced a folded document from his coat. The document claimed, in the precise and airless language of men who use paper to accomplish what they would rather not do in person, that the deed to Whispering Ridge and the 40 acres surrounding it had been improperly recorded. that the original land grant, filed in the county seat in 1869, contained an error of boundary description that rendered the subsequent transfer, the transfer by which Huck had come to own this land, legally void, and that the party represented by Mr. Caldwell had filed to correct this error and claim the property as rightfully theirs. The party, though Caldwell did not say the name directly, was Silas Montgomery. Huck stood in the cold and read the document without expression. He read it slowly, the way a man reads who taught himself the skill and respects it enough not to rush. When he finished, he folded it carefully and held it out to Alice, who had come to stand beside him. She read it faster and with a different quality of attention. The attention of someone who had grown up watching her mother navigate the paperwork of poverty, lease agreements and landlord notices, and the small bureaucratic humiliations of people without money or connections. She recognized the architecture of the document immediately. It was technically correct in its language and fundamentally dishonest in its intent, the legal equivalent of a knife held politely. "This references the original 1869 grant," she said. "Do you have your copy?" "Inside," Huck said. "Then we'll need to look at it." Caldwell smiled the smile of a man who has been through this particular scene before and knows how it ends. "Take all the time you need," he said, with the generous patience of someone who is certain of the outcome. "We'll be in Bitter Creek. You have until the end of the month." They rode back down the trail, and the sound of their horses faded into the trees, and the mountain was quiet again. But the quality of the quiet had changed. It was the quiet of something that has been decided somewhere else and is now simply making its way toward you. Inside, Huck went to the chest beneath his bed, the same chest from which he had taken the quilt, and produced from beneath a folded oilskin, a bundle of papers tied with cord. He laid them on the table and sat down. Alice sat across from him, and they went through them together, spreading each document flat, reading carefully, organizing by date. It was in the third document that Alice found it. It was a letter, not a legal document, handwritten, dated November 1868, addressed to the county land office, and signed by a man named Harlan Voss, the original surveyor of the Whispering Ridge parcel. In it, Voss described a discrepancy he had noticed between the field measurements and the recorded boundary description, and noted that he had filed a corrected survey with the county seat the following January. If that corrected survey existed, it would invalidate Montgomery's claim entirely. "Did you know about this?" Alice asked. "No," Huck said. He was looking at the letter with the expression of a man who is reassembling something he did not know had been broken. "Martha handled the papers. After she died—" He stopped. He looked at the table. "I kept everything. I didn't always know what I was keeping." Alice looked at the date on the letter and thought for a moment. Then she looked at Huck. "The corrected survey would be in the county records, if it was filed." "That's 3 days' ride." "I know." He looked up at her. "The snow—" "I know," she said again. "But Huck—" "If Montgomery has people at the county seat working on this, they won't leave that survey in the records any longer than they have to." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones they had shared before. Not the comfortable silence of two people at ease with each other, but the taut, specific silence of a problem that has a shape and a deadline and is sitting on the table between you demanding to be solved. Then Huck told her the other thing, the thing he had not told her. He told it simply, without dramatics, looking at the table as he spoke. Martha, his wife, had not died of illness. She had died in a fall from the upper trail in conditions that Huck had believed from the beginning were not an accident. There had been a man with her, or near her, a man who worked for Silas Montgomery. The sheriff in Bitter Creek had declined to investigate on the grounds of insufficient evidence, and Huck had spent the years since in the particular hell of a man who knows what happened to the person he loved and cannot prove it and cannot stop knowing. Montgomery wanted the land. He had wanted it since before Huck had settled it. The timber on the upper 40 acres alone was worth more than most men in Bitter Creek would see in a lifetime. And Montgomery was the kind of man who, when he wanted something, arranged for the obstacles to remove themselves, by paper if possible, and by other means if necessary. Alice sat very still through all of it. When he finished, she did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to. She did not offer comfort in the way of words, because she understood that what he had just done was not ask for comfort. It was the act of a man finally setting down something he had been carrying alone for too long. And the right response to that was not sympathy, but presence. She simply sat across from him and let him know, by not looking away, that she had heard all of it, and was not diminished by it, and was not going anywhere. He looked up at her eventually. His eyes were dry. He was not a man who wept easily, or perhaps at all. But there was something in his face that she recognized, the expression of someone who has just been believed by another person for the first time in a long time, and does not quite know yet what to do with the feeling. "I should have told you before," he said. "You told me now," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Alice." "Yes?" He seemed to search for what came next, and not find it. What he said finally was not eloquent. It was simply true. "I'm glad you're here." She held his gaze, and the fire made its sounds, and outside the snow lay over everything, white and heavy and indifferent to the small human dramas being conducted within. "So am I," she said. It was the most honest thing either of them had said in a very long time. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from losing someone and being told that how it happened does not matter, that there is nothing to be done, that the machinery of power and money and influence has already decided the outcome, and your pain is simply the sound it makes as it moves. Huck Kalulton had lived inside that grief for a year. He had built his days around it the way you build a house around a crack in the foundation, carefully, constantly, always knowing it is there. And Alice Abernathy had spent a lifetime being told that what she was, her face, her leg, her history, made her less than she was, that the world's measure of her was the correct one, that she should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity were permitted to fall in her direction. Two people carrying invisible weights, finding each other in the winter of a mountain they had both, in different ways, been forced to claim. We all believe we are good until the storm tests our roots. We believe we would stand firm, speak up, reach out. But courage is not a quality you discover in calm weather. It reveals itself only when the cost of having it is real. And so the true question is never what you would do in the abstract. It is what you will do now, today, when the cold is actual and the risk is named, and the person beside you is asking, without words, whether you intend to stay. They came back on a Sunday, not 3 men this time, 7. Caldwell rode at the front. Behind him came 2 men carrying torches, though it was full daylight, and the torches were not for light. Behind them came 4 others with rifles across their saddles, And behind all of them, on a bay horse that cost more than most families in Bitter Creek earned in a year, rode Silas Montgomery himself. Alice saw them from the window and said, "Huck!" He was already at the door. Montgomery did not dismount. He spoke from the saddle the way men speak when they have decided the conversation is already finished. The land was his by legal right, he said. The paperwork had been filed. The county had recognized the claim. They had until sundown to vacate the property and take only what they could carry. Huck stood on the porch and said nothing. His rifle was inside. His hands were empty. He stood the way a mountain stands, not because it is unafraid, but because it has decided that fear is not relevant to what comes next. Then Montgomery looked past him at Alice, who had come to stand in the doorway. "You," he said, and his voice carried the particular contempt of a man confronting evidence of his own failure. "I should have known you'd land somewhere like this, with someone like him." Alice stepped off the porch and stood beside Huck. "You wrote me 23 letters," she said. Her voice was steady. "You described a man of character, of integrity. I came 2,000 miles on the strength of your words." She reached into her coat and produced the letters. She had kept every one, folded small, in the inner pocket against her chest. She held them up. "These letters describe the boundary of your property in your own handwriting, Mr. Montgomery. A boundary that does not include Whispering Ridge. You wrote it yourself in the third letter, when you were trying to impress me with how much land you did not own." Montgomery's horse shifted. Something moved through the group of riders, not quite uncertainty, but the precursor to it. "That document means nothing," Montgomery said. "It will mean something to a judge," Alice said, "along with the corrected survey filed by Harlan Voss in January 1869, which I have already arranged to have copied and witnessed by 2 officers of the county court." She paused. "I had time while you were gathering your men." The silence that followed had weight. Montgomery looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the station platform. And what crossed his face was not rage, but something colder, recognition. The recognition of a man who has just understood that he has underestimated the wrong person. He looked at the men with torches. "Don't," Huck said. It was the first word he had spoken. He said it quietly, without heat, the way you say a word you mean completely. His hand rested on the porch rail. His eyes did not move from Montgomery's face. "There are children in that cabin." The torchbearers looked at Montgomery. Montgomery looked at Huck, and Huck looked back at him with the absolute stillness of a man who has already decided, whatever happens next, exactly where he stands and what he will protect. Montgomery turned his horse. He said nothing. No concession, no acknowledgement. He simply turned and rode back down the trail, and his men followed, one by one, the torches still lit and going nowhere, and the sound of them faded into the trees and was gone. Huck stood on the porch until the last sound died. Then he turned and looked at Alice. She was still holding the letters. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands, carefully, the way you hold something you have come to understand the value of, and pressed his forehead to hers, and stood there breathing in the cold air, saying nothing, because there was nothing left that needed words. She closed her eyes. Behind them, through the cabin wall, they could hear Samuel and Nora arguing about something small and ordinary, the blameless noise of children who had not been afraid today because the 2 people standing on the porch had made sure of it. True strength is not the loudest voice in the room or the most rifles on the trail. True strength is the person who stands between the door and the fire, who knows exactly what they are protecting
and does not flinch when the cost of protecting it becomes real. Huck Cololton did not win that day with force. He won it by being the kind of man who does not move. And Alice Abernathy did not win it with anger. She won it by having paid attention to every letter, every detail, every small truth that the powerful leave carelessly behind because they do not believe anyone is watching. The night after Montgomery rode away, the snow came back. Not the tentative dusting of early winter, but the real thing, heavy and purposeful, falling straight down in the windless dark, as though the mountain had decided to draw a curtain around everything that had happened and give them space to breathe. By morning, the trail down to Bitter Creek was buried under 2 feet of white, and the world beyond the tree line had ceased, for the time being, to exist. It was the quietest day Alice could remember. She made breakfast while the children slept late, and Huck came in from the barn and sat at the table and accepted the coffee she poured without a word. And they sat in that particular silence that belongs only to people who have been through something together and have not yet found the language for it. The fire was high and even. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the cabin held its warmth like a kept promise. Samuel came out first, hair pressed flat on one side from sleep, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the two of them sitting together at the table, with his father's coffee and her biscuits between them, and something in his expression shifted. Something that had been braced against possibility, slowly releasing its grip. He sat down without being asked and held out his cup for milk and said nothing, which was, for Samuel, a form of acceptance so complete it required no translation. Nora came after, climbed directly into Alice's lap without asking permission, and went back to sleep sitting up. Alice held her with one arm and drank her coffee with the other hand, and looked across the table at Huck, who was watching her with that expression she had come to know. The mountains, Nora had said, and she had been exactly right. Open and unguarded, and quietly overwhelmed by something he had not known he was still capable of feeling. "Whatever comes next," Alice said quietly, careful not to wake Nora. "From the county, or from Montgomery, or from wherever else, we'll manage it." "I know," Huck said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not the accidental contact of the map, not the reflex of the wagon trail, but a deliberate and unhurried thing. A hand placed over another hand, by a man who has decided, without theater or declaration, that this is where he belongs. "Neither am I," he said. The fire settled. The snow fell. Nora breathed slowly against Alice's shoulder, small and warm and trusting, in the way that only children are trusting, completely, without reservation, without keeping any part of themselves in reserve against disappointment. Samuel refilled his own cup and pretended not to notice anything, which meant he had noticed everything. Alice turned her hand over beneath Huck's and held it. She did not cry. She was not, in the end, a woman who cried easily. But she felt the particular fullness of a moment that contains everything you did not believe you were allowed to want. The warmth of the cabin, the weight of the child in her arms, the rough warmth of the hand holding hers across the scarred pine table, the sound of the fire and the snow, and the total, complete, unambiguous fact of belonging somewhere. She thought about the station platform, about the 42 cents, about the 23 letters and the 2,000 miles and every room she had entered quietly, trying to take up as little space as possible. She was not doing that now. She was here, fully, taking up exactly the space she was owed,
Later, when the children had gone to play in the snow and the cabin had gone quiet around them, Huck came to stand beside her at the window where she was watching Samuel and Nora carve something ambitious and structurally unsound out of a drift near the fence.
He stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away, and they watched the children together in the gray winter light. After a while, he said, "Alice." "Yes?" "I don't know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not a man who finds words easily." "I know," she said. "You don't need them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned from the window and looked at her profile, the scar, the straight spine, the particular quality of attention she brought to everything she looked at. And something in his face completed itself, the way a sentence completes itself when the last word finally arrives. He leaned down and kissed her, not her cheek this time, her mouth, gently, with the care of a man who understands that some things, once broken, take a long time to trust again, and who is in no hurry, and who intends to be worth the wait. She kissed him back.
Outside, Samuel shouted something at Nora about the structural integrity of their snow construction. Nora disagreed loudly. The mountain held the sound of them, and the snow fell, and the window fogged slightly with the warmth from inside. When they broke apart, Alice looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she turned back to the window, and he stayed where he was, his shoulder against hers, and they watched the children, and the afternoon light fell across the snow in long blue shadows, and the question that lived in all of it, whether this would hold, whether the world outside would permit it, whether two people this careful with themselves could learn to be less careful with each other, remained unanswered. It would be answered, or it would not. But it would be answered here, on this mountain, in this cabin, beside this fire. That, for now, was everything. Home is not the place you were born. It is not the place that was given to you, or promised to you, or written on a deed filed in a county office. Home is the place where someone has looked at the parts of you that the world calls damaged, and found them, instead, to be the most honest parts of you, where you are not required to take up less space, where your history is not a liability, where the fire is kept because someone thought to keep it before you asked. Alice Abernathy came to Whispering Ridge with 42 cents and a trunk and the ruins of a false promise. She found something the false promise could never have given her. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, but a partnership, built in the cold, tested by the storm, chosen freely on both sides by two people who understood at last that the bravest thing either of them had ever done was simply to stay.
Every time I see your comments come in, from cities I have never visited, from people I will never meet, in languages I am still learning to recognize, I am reminded of something that no algorithm can manufacture and no platform can replicate. The simple, stubborn fact that stories connect us. You came here today, wherever you are in the world, and you stayed. Through the cold of the station platform and the long road up the mountain and the firelight in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and something slowly becoming home. You stayed for Alice, who refused to perform shame on cue. You stayed for Huck, who said everything important without words. And perhaps, if I am honest, you stayed for yourself. For the part of you that knows what it is to stand on a platform with 42 cents and a heart full of something the world has not yet agreed to call valuable. I read every comment, every one. And if you are listening to this from a city, a countryside, a kitchen,
A car on a long drive home. I want to know. Tell me where you are in the world right now. Not because the algorithm needs it, but because this story traveled a long way to find you, and I think that distance deserves to be named. If you still believe that the right person, in the right moment, can change the entire weather of a life, then don't go anywhere. The next story is already waiting, and it was written for exactly that kind of heart.